Good evening, everybody. We're going to be in Matthew, the 25th chapter. So if you have your Bibles handy, go ahead and open up to that. If you don't have your Bible handy, go ahead and grab one because we'll be doing quite a bit of reading tonight, not just in Matthew chapter 25, as you can see on your screen there. We'll also be in Luke, the 19th chapter, if you want to jump over to that. We'll also probably delve a little bit into Corinthians. So if you want to go ahead and open up to 2 Corinthians chapter 9, I think that's where we'll be very quickly. But we're discussing the parable of the talents. We'll discuss the context more explicitly here in just a couple minutes. But I wanted to put this parable right here because I think the last few weeks, probably the last 4 or 5 weeks, we've discussed various parables that fit into this specific timeline that Jesus is dealing with. When you look at the parable of the talents in Matthew 25, it comes in a very explicit context in Jesus' life. Now, some of these parables that Jesus preaches, he kind of does them in passing. It says, as they're going on this village, he then stops and says various things. Or when he sees a tree, he talks to somebody, or in regards to a conversation, he brings forth this parable. This parable that's mentioned here in Matthew 25 has a very distinct background and context that we're going to look at just a little bit tonight. But just kind of in terms of foreshadowing towards it, this parable comes in response to 3 or 2 questions that the apostles asked. Some people see it as 2, some people see it as 3. But in Matthew chapter 24, the first few verses, the question comes up to Jesus as the disciples are showing him around Jerusalem. Jesus says, do you see these stones? Not one of them is going to be left unturned. Jesus then says, or the apostles then say, what is the sign of this? What is the sign of your coming? What is the sign of the end of the age? That could be 2 questions. I tend to think it's 3, but Jesus does answer them all in turn in Matthew chapters 24 and 25. And directly after Matthew chapter 25, verses 14 through 30, Jesus then launches into the great throne room scene, the great judgment scene, where he takes the entire mass of humanity and divides them from his left to his right, and goats on one side, sheep on the other. He's talking about end times. He's talking about Judgment Day in these last 2 chapters of the book, or in these 2 chapters of the book of Matthew. But he wants them, and this is definitely giving away the ending of the talents and this context. The point is to be ready. That's what I want you to do. Be ready, but I want you to be prepared. I want you to live your life as if God can come at any moment. I want you to live your life as if he's right around the corner, even though for some of these people, it's obviously not going to happen in their lifetime, may happen in ours. But 2,000 years have passed since Jesus talks about these things and delivers these parables. So people that think that the world is coming to an end immediately are kind of missing the point. But this is a belief that exists now, especially with COVID and everything that's happening. People think that the end of time is right around the corner. It's next week. It's a couple years from now. People had the same belief 2,000 years ago. As a matter of fact, we mentioned Luke chapter 19. Go ahead and put your finger in Matthew 25 and look at Luke chapter 19. This is a very similar parable. People call them sister parables because they're so similar. Luke chapter 19, though, is the parable of the minas, which is different than the parable of the talents. Comes in a different time period. If you look at Luke chapter 19, starting in verse 1, it says he has entered Jericho, is passing through. Zacchaeus is up in a sycamore tree there in the first few verses. If you look later, if you look in verse 11, it says that he's near Jerusalem. So he's not in Jerusalem at this point. Parable of the talents happens in Jerusalem because he gives that parable in response to them showing him Jerusalem and the buildings of Jerusalem, that type of stuff. So they're 2 different time periods, 2 very explicitly different areas that Jesus is in, yet very similar parables. And yet the mindset is what I wanted to focus on. Luke chapter 19, starting in verse 11, it says, while they were listening to these things, Jesus went on to tell them a parable because he was near Jerusalem and they supposed that the kingdom of God was going to appear immediately. They thought that Jesus was right around the corner. The parable of the talents speaks about that. The parable of the minas speaks about that. But the difference in these 2 parables, because they're not the same parable, there's a few distinct differences. The parable of the minas not only addresses the idea of being ready, but it also addresses the idea of people rejecting Jesus as the king. If you look in verse 12, at the parable of the minas begins, it says, a nobleman went into a distant country to receive a kingdom for himself and then returned. He called 10 of his slaves and gave them 10 minas and said to them, do business with this till I come back. Citizens hated them, sent him a delegation after him saying, we don't want this man to reign over us. So the king is king over a certain country, leaves to receive another kingdom, which is not uncommon in that time period. Conquering king is existing over one area. His armies has attacked and captured another area. He goes and receives that kingdom, receives the crown. It's very popular in history to receive crowns in multiple areas. David even did this. David receives the crown, I believe, in Bethel. He receives it once again in Jerusalem to not only be king over Israel, but also over Judah. So it's not uncommon for kings to receive crowns over different countries, kind of to expand his empire, to kind of hopefully bring them all under one flag. So it's not abnormal. What he does here in verse 13 is what the master does in the parable of the talents. Goes to a different country, goes out of the area for a while, but he leaves people in charge of his belongings. He gives 10 of his slaves 10 minas, one each, says, do business with this till I come back. You're in charge of the stewardship of my empire. Verse 14, citizens hate him, tell him, we don't want you to come back. The person comes back, and then he calls everybody into account. He calls his 10 slaves to account. He calls the people who hated him into account. And that's kind of the second part of this parable of the minas, is that the people, very much like the story of the wicked vine dressers, they don't want God reigning over them. And so when the king comes back, they basically outright rejected him. And what happens, you can see, is what you would expect to happen if you jump down to verse 27. These enemies of mine who did not want me to reign over them, bring them here and slay them in my presence. You've rejected me, I've rejected you. That's what you do as a king. You can't have people who are unloyal to you operating inside your kingdom. That's King 101. But regardless, the parable of the minas is different from the talents in that very specific idea. Then you look back here at verse 15. He calls these 10 slaves, this is the part that is very similar, calls these 10 slaves, each one of them has one. He brings them up and he says, give an account of the business that you had performed. First appears, verse 16, Master, your 1 mina has made 10 more. The second one says, your 1 mina has made 5 more. The 1 mina person says, my 1 mina, I kept it, here's your 1 mina back. I didn't bring back a second one, which is what I should have done. I didn't lose it, but I didn't gain anything with it either. The response from the master is the exact same type of thing. He says, you're an exacting man, you knew what I was about, and because of that, because of your fear of me, you didn't lay down and you're not reaping what you didn't sow. So you didn't do anything with that mina. But listen to what he says in verse 22, because this I think is applicable to both of these parables. Luke chapter 19, verse 22, he says, by your own words, I will judge you, you worthless slave. Focus on that. You know, when we stand before God in judgment, we're going to give an account of our lives towards God for better or for worse. Why did you do this? Why did you do this? What was the point of that? We will give an account of our lives towards God. And what he says here in verse 22 is, by your own words, I will judge you. We can't hide anything. We will not be able to lie our way into heaven. Everything will be laid bare towards God for our things done in the body, both good or bad. By our own words, we will be judged. And that's a very scary concept for us if we've been living kind of a double-faced life, a two-sided life, where we've been maybe playing the hypocrite at the church building and we've been, living a different life on social media. And then on the weekends, we've been out doing something we know we shouldn't be doing, or, doing something during the day we know we shouldn't be doing. We should keep in mind that our lives are fully transparent towards God 100% of the time. And God knows exactly what we're about. He's just asking us to give an account for that. He knows exactly what we're about. So, parable of the minas, very similar to the parable of the talents. Not the same parable, though. Jesus would oftentimes use very similar parables, very similar type themes. As we mentioned last week, Jesus gives the model prayer on 2 different occasions, 2 completely different contexts. Matthew chapter 6, Luke the 11th chapter, different areas, different time periods, and yet the model prayer comes up in both of those. So it's likely to assume, it's probably well assumed, that Jesus uses similar themes, similar stories, similar teachings, regardless of where he's at a specific time period. Before we go any further, though, into the parable of the talents, I want to ask you, what is this parable about? There are people that look at this parable and think that what Jesus is addressing is the idea of making good investments. I've heard people use the parable of the talents to refute gambling, that you shouldn't gamble because you should always make good investments. And I agree with the fact that we shouldn't gamble. I don't think the parable of the talents really speaks to that, but I think the danger with thinking that this parable refutes bad investments, that you need to be good investments, is it can kind of cripple us with fear. We think to ourselves, well, unless something's a sure bet, then there's no way for me to risk that because I need to be a good steward of that. I agree with that principle a little bit, but we need to temper that, because if we think about that approach in regards to evangelism, for instance, we'll be hesitant to talk to somebody and spend time with them because we're worried that they won't become a Christian. And so we're not going to talk to them because that's wasting our time. That's not the approach that we should have, because we don't know what's going to happen. So I don't think necessarily the idea of good investments is really what he's teaching. There's some people that talk about how this teaches against the idea of laziness. You need to be always working. He certainly does call him lazy and worthless in this passage, but I don't think laziness is really what he's after. I think what he's addressing here is a necessity of preparation. Being ready at all times. We talked about that a couple minutes ago. The fact that we need to be ready at all times for the reality of God's imminent appearing. The fact that he's coming right around the corner. It can come at any point in time, no matter what time of day it is, what part of our life, what we're doing. It can come at any point in time. And I think that's what you see in this passage. Remember, we talked about a little bit earlier the context. We talked about these three questions that happen here in Matthew chapter 24, verses 1 through 3. These three questions. What's the sign of this? What's the sign of your coming? What's the sign of the end of the age? And then he mentions, if you look back at chapter 24, verses 45 through 51, the necessity of preparation. Look at verse 45. Who then is the faithful and sensible slave whom his master put in charge of his household to give them their food at the proper time? Blessed is that slave whom his master finds so doing when he comes. Truly I say to you that he will put him in charge of all his possessions. But if that evil slave says in his heart, my master is not coming for a long time, and begins to beat his fellow slaves and eat and drink with drunkards, the master of that slave will come on a day when he does not expect him, and at an hour which he does not know, and will cut him in pieces and assign him a place with the hypocrites, and in that place there'll be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Our expectation of God's return will influence our behavior here on earth. We need to realize that if you don't think that God is coming anytime soon, which we all know that God is coming around the corner. We all know that. We all say that. We all pay lip service to that. But if you don't really believe that, then your life is going to reflect that, which is part of the problem with some of these false doctrines that you see in the world today about the idea that the resurrection's already come, which, by the way, 1 Corinthians 15 is all about. If you're the type of person who believes the resurrection's already happened, 1 Corinthians 15, read it, study it, that's what it's all about. The danger with that type of belief is that you don't believe that God's coming again, so you can live however you want to. But when you live in a state of perpetual preparation, which that was really hard to say, by the way, when you live in a state of perpetual preparation, then you're living your life the way you should. The fact that God can come around the corner tomorrow scares me to death. It makes me want to live right today because I don't know what my life is going to be like tomorrow. So be ready for his imminent return. That should be a joyful thing. And then when you look at chapter 25, verses 1 through 13, that adds the second layer on that. Be aware that Jesus can come at any point in time, but also prepare for that. These 10 virgins did not prepare. 5 of them did, but 5 of them didn't. 5 of them did not make the proper preparations for the bridegroom to show up, and it showed. Because they weren't prepared, they weren't able to then enter into the kingdom or enter into the wedding feast. So we need to remember Ephesians chapter 5, verse 16. That's why it's up there right now. Make the most of your time, for the days are evil. We need to remember this idea of preparation all the time. As a matter of fact, that to me is the biggest part of chapters 24 and 25 as a whole. If you get away from all the end times prophecies and all the things that he talks about, the overall point is be ready, be prepared, realize that Jesus can come at all times. The point of this parable, Matthew chapter 25, the parable of the talents, to me, and the danger is sometimes when we look at these passages about being ready, make the most of your time for the days of evil, the temptation sometimes is, well, I'm going to become extremely neurotic about that. And I'm going to live every single day, maximizing every single second and thinking, well, if I don't squeeze every last bit of efficiency out of every last minute, then I'm just not a good Christian. And people will say, well, I can't have fun because I'm going to make the most of every second. Jesus is coming. I got to do everything I can today. There's a point that it becomes obsessive. I don't think that we should become neurotic about it. I don't think that we should work ourselves into a fit over Jesus coming at any moment, because that can make us extremely paranoid. It will also burn us out very quickly. See somebody shoot like a bolt of lightning for a couple years, maybe even a decade, but eventually they'll become jaded because they worked all this time and Jesus hasn't come yet. So you need to temper that with expectations, realistic expectations. But I also think that we shouldn't really waste any time. People always say that, I just wasted a day. I just wasted, a week. And there's times, obviously, we need to have fun. Everybody needs to relax, take a vacation. I get that. but we shouldn't really just sit around and say, I'm just going to not do anything for the next decade. I'm just going to go on autopilot. Because if we're not making the most of our time, then we're not really being the type of stewards that we should be. We've said this before in other Bible classes. We've said this before in sermons. If you have breath in your body in any type of capacity, if you're bedbound, if you're disabled, if you're if you have obligations that make up most of your life, whatever your situation is, there is some way that you can make the most of that. And that's one thing I really want us to focus on. As a matter of fact, when you look, for instance, at the parable or the story of the great throne room scene, the question in all of that is what did you do with what I gave you? I gave you this. What did you do with that? When you look at the parable of the talents, the teaching is very plain. Some are given 5, some are given 2, some are given 1. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what you got. It matters what you're doing with it. So that's the teaching of the parable of the talents. And if we remember nothing else from this passage, I want us to really focus in on that. I want you to look, and we mentioned earlier 2 Corinthians 9. I want you to look at 2 Corinthians 9 because this is right in line with what we're teaching or talking about at this point in the class. 2 Corinthians chapter 9, starting verse 6. 2 Corinthians chapter 9, starting verse 6 says, Now this I say, he who sows sparingly will also reap sparingly. He who sows bountifully will also reap bountifully. Each one must do just as he has purposed in his heart, not grudgingly or under compulsion, for God loves a cheerful giver. And we use verse 7 to talk about the collection plate on Sunday. That's a very limited measurement of this verse. It's talking about our lives. Verse 8, God is able to make all grace abound to you so that always having all sufficiency in everything, you may have an abundance for every good deed. It's talking about our life. As is written, verse 9, he scattered abroad, he gave to the poor, his righteousness endures forever. Now he who supplies, verse 10, seed to the sower and bread for food, will supply and multiply your seed for sowing and increase the harvest of your righteousness. You will be enriched in everything for all liberality, which through us is producing thanksgiving towards God. For the ministry of the service is not only fully supplying the needs of the saints, but is also overflowing through many thanksgivings to God. Because of the proof given by this ministry, they will glorify God for your obedience to your confession of the gospel of Christ and for the liberality of your contribution to them and to all, while they also, by prayer on your behalf, yearn for you because of the surpassing grace of God in you. Thanks be to God for his indescribable gift. He is directly addressing here in 2 Corinthians chapter 9 the impact of individual contributions on the kingdom as a whole. And what he doesn't say in this passage, and it is very noticeably absent, keep this in mind, what he doesn't put in this passage is quotas. He never says that you need to give $1,000 a month. He never says you need to give $1 a month. What he says is, if you sow sparingly, and only you and only I know if you and I are reaping sparingly. Only I know if I'm reaping or sowing sparingly. Only I know what I'm capable of financially, emotionally, time-wise. Only I know that. And if I sow sparingly, I will also reap sparingly. So for that reason, in regards to the kingdom of God, we need to be overflowing in our abundance towards him, giving of ourselves, giving of our livelihood, so that we could, giving of our time, so that we can help with the kingdom. That's what it's all about. God did not care. And in the parable of Matthew 25, the master did not care that the 3-talent man or the 2-talent man did not give 5 talents back. Didn't care about that. What he cared about was that he made the most of what was given to him. That's the important thing to remember about this parable of the talents. And so as we read this parable, starting Matthew chapter 25, verse 14, I want you to keep that in mind, that it's not about what you don't have, but what you have. And you alone know the limits of your generosity and your hospitality and your benevolence and your work and what you can accomplish. So keep that in mind. Matthew chapter 25, starting verse 14. He backs right up here in verse 13, says, Be on the alert, then you don't know the day nor the hour. For it is just like, talking about the kingdom of heaven, it is just like a man about to go on a journey, who called his own slaves and entrusted his possessions to them. Notice the difference between the talents and the mina. It's not a king going off to receive another kingdom. He's just going on a journey. And what he does is he brings his slaves and entrusts his possessions to them. To one of them he gave 5 talents, to another 2, to another 1, each according to his own ability. That's an important verse. That's an important mention, because as he mentions there in verse 5, each of you have been given talents according to your own ability, which, by the way that we get our modern word for talent is from this parable. So talent in that day and age meant a unit of currency, but it eventually transformed into what you're able to do, your specific skill set, your ability, your specific workload. So talents, then money, today's world, pretty much means everything. And I think that's a good way to bring that up. I think that's a good thing. But in verse 15, gives 5 talents to another 2, to another 1, each according to his own ability. And then he went on his journey. I want to make one more point about that real quick. 1 Corinthians chapter 12, Paul writes about the nature of spiritual gifts. And he makes a mention in 1 Corinthians 12, I think around verse 14 or 15, where he says that God has set the members in the body, each one of them just as he pleased. The dispute in 1 Corinthians 12 was, well, I don't have the gift of tongues, therefore what I'm doing is obviously worthless. I can't amount to much. But he says there in that passage that God has put the members in the body, each one just as he pleased. And it's the working together of all of those units that makes the kingdom. Same principle that happens here in verse 15. Gave to each one of them according to their own ability and went on his journey. Doesn't mean one's better, doesn't mean one's worse. It just means that each one was given something that they can make the most of. They all have the responsibility and the capability of executing on their gift. Verse 16. Immediately the one who had received the 5 talents went and traded with them and gained 5 more talents. In the same manner, the one who had received the 2 talents gained 2 more. But he who had received the 1 talent went away, dug a hole in the ground, and hid his master's money. Verse 19. Now after a long time, the master of the slaves came and settled accounts with them. And the one who had received the 5 talents came up and brought 5 more talents, saying, Master, you entrusted 5 talents to me. See, I have gained 5 more talents. Notice how he almost can't wait to tell his master what he's accomplished. He's looking forward to his master's return because he's going to show off what he's done. Not in a braggy way, but he's going to show off what he's done. Verse 21, well done, good and faithful slave. You were faithful to a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Enter into the joy of your master. I love that phrase, enter into the joy of your master. You have a place with me, the master says, because of your stewardship. You have taken what I have given you, and you have added to that. We are working in fellowship. We are working in harmony together because you've taken my possessions and added to them. Our work in the kingdom is seen as being a part of something bigger. And because of our work in the kingdom, my work as this, your work in this, we enjoy the fruits of each other's labor. Ultimately, we enjoy the fruits of God's labor as well. We're all working together to have that relationship with God. Verse 22. Also, one who had received the 2 talents came up and said, Master, you entrusted 2 talents to me. See, I've gained 2 more talents. And the master said to him, well done, good and faithful slave. You were faithful with a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Enter into the joy of your master. Same thing. The one who had also received the 1 talent came up and said, Master, I knew you to be a hard man, reaping where you didn't sow and gathering where you scattered no seed. And I was afraid and went away and hid your talent in the ground. See, you have what is yours. I want you to think about that mentality. We look at this person in verses 24 and 25 and we think, what a worthless and a lazy person. It's exactly what the master said. Worthless person. And he excused his laziness by blaming it on the master. Think about that. He blames his own laziness on the master by claiming that the master is somebody who is difficult, somebody who reaps where he didn't sow, and somebody who gathers where he didn't scatter any seed. That's the mentality that so many people have towards God. That he is somebody who's difficult, somebody who asks a lot of us, and somebody who expects us to return to him things that he hasn't even, quote, done himself. Why should I go talk to this guy when he's just, there's no groundwork being laid. He's as sinful as could be. He doesn't care about the God. Why should I go talk to him? That's the mentality that we have towards God. And there will be a lot of people that will stand on Judgment Day and will try to excuse away their own inaction by blaming it on God himself. And that is a problem. And yet you see it here in verses 24 and 25. He says, I was afraid. I went away and hid your talent in the ground. See, you have what is yours. Notice, he doesn't lose it. And that's what so many of us are afraid of. So many of us are afraid of the fact that we're going to somehow mess up the kingdom. I don't want to go talk to this guy because maybe I'll turn him away. You always hear that. I can't talk to somebody because I don't know enough. That is the worst excuse known to man. I can't talk to this person because I don't know enough. I don't care how much you know. I don't care how much you've read of them. If you know that you need to be baptized, if you know that you have sin that needs to be forgiven, you know enough. And this person says, people say all the time, well, I don't want to go because I don't want to mess it up. I don't want to lead singing because I'll mess it up. I don't want to study the Bible because I'll misunderstand it. That's the worst excuse, because there's always going to be people that will help you. And as we talked about last week, do you not think that God will help you? This person here in verse 25 hides his talent in the ground because he's afraid of what his master is going to say about his work. See, you have what is yours. And you can almost feel the same type of smugness that the other two guys had. The other two guys earned it. But this guy says, in a very smug way, you have what is yours. You didn't lose it. But his master answered and said to him, you wicked and lazy slave, you knew that I reap where I didn't sow. You know that I gather where I scatter no seeds. You should have at least put my money in the bank, and on my arrival I would have received my money with interest. Take away the talent from him. Give it to one who has the 10 talents. For everyone who has, more shall be given, and he will have an abundance. But from the one who does not have, even what he does have shall be taken away. Throw the worthless slave into the outer darkness, and that place will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. There is no part in my kingdom for you, because you didn't work in it. You didn't do anything. You're just there. You're just a body. You're just a lump of flesh. And that's not saying that people in today's world, that God hates people, but what it is emphasizing is the fact that God wants workers. If we have made the decision to become a member of the body of Christ, we need to be active. There are no passive Christians in the kingdom. There are no autopilot Christians. There are no people who are just floating by. Every single one of us needs to be active in some way, form, or fashion. So now, I want to look at very briefly, some things that God expects of us. Because if we're being honest about this parable, it's scary sometimes to think about what God expects. This person was afraid because of what he knew the master would expect of him. So what does God expect of us? Number one, he expects us to be ready for his return. We need to be prepared. We need to be living as if that God can come at any time of the day, any time of the night, anything, and at any point he can come. He can come while you're listening to this right now. We need to be ready for his return, but that involves being prepared for his return. It also means that we need to work in his absence. Just because Jesus isn't sitting right here next to us doesn't mean that he's not present, and doesn't mean that he doesn't expect us to be active and to be working in the kingdom. We need to be working in his absence to prepare and to be ready for his return. Number three, as we talked about this a little bit about this at the beginning, we need to take calculated risks. Now, I'm not saying here in this passage that we need to just throw caution to the wind and put ourselves in the deepest part of sin that we can be to hopefully kind of bring some good out of it. That's not my point. But the point is we need to put ourselves out there. You know, if you've never talked to your friend about the gospel, do that this week. Do that the next couple of days. Find some time to do that. I think there's a noticeable balance in the 5 talents and 5 talents received thing. You know, we're so conditioned to think about, you know, maybe our work with God in terms of rate of return. You know, we think, well, if I put this amount in, then I'm going to get this amount out. And God is not saying that if you talk to 1,000 people, 1,000 people are going to be converted. That's not the point. Noah preached for, from what we can tell, around 100 years. And nobody got on that boat except for his family. We don't even know if they wanted to be there. Peter preaches one sermon on Pentecost and 3,000 people come forward to be baptized. It's not an equitable rate of return, and that bothers us. But I do think that we notice, at least in this, a little bit of a balance here. You know, if I go talk to 5 people and none of those 5 people become Christians, that doesn't mean that I haven't done anything good. What that does mean is I've planted 5 seeds that hopefully somebody later can then come and build on. That's an important point to remember. Take calculated risks in regards to our work with God. Don't just throw caution to the wind, but when you know what you need to be doing, or even if you don't, think about what you need to be doing. When we know what we need to be doing, we need to do it. And we need to have faith that God is going to be there for us. We need to have faith that God is going to help us in some form or fashion as we work in his kingdom. Number 4, we need to be working to grow the master's wealth. Now, the master's wealth is not physical possessions. That's obvious from the parable of the minas. He's not interested in receiving some kind of physical kingdom. His treasure is the spiritual kingdom. His treasure is the church. And that's what he wants to enlarge. I think it's a great parallel when you think about the master's wealth expanding and the kingdom expanding. The true treasure of God is the church. That's why Paul calls it, at least in part, the bride of Christ. It should be his crowning, I don't want to say possession because that's kind of be demeaning of women, but it's his crowning, association of sorts. That's what he needs to enlarge. That's what he wants to enlarge. And so we need to be trying to grow the master's wealth every single day. That doesn't always happen in regards to evangelism, but it does happen in regards to study, helping other Christians, growing the kingdom in some form or fashion. And then finally, we need to expect more responsibility. One of the last parts of this parable talks about in verses 29 through 30 that to him who has more shall be given. Parable of the minas in Luke the 19th chapter, they're aghast at the fact that they gave the one mina that the third person didn't do anything with, gave it to the one who had 10. Didn't give it to the guy who had 5, gave it to the one who had 10. And in this parable of the talents, the person that has been given, the person that didn't do anything with their talent, it's taken from them and given to the one who has 5. Not 2, but 5. So to him who has, to the one who displays that he can grow and that he can help other people grow, you should expect more responsibility. And I'm not just saying that God will drop it in your lap, but I think as we grow, we'll see more opportunities from growth. As we grow, as we learn, we'll see more ways that we can enlarge the kingdom and we can grow the master's wealth. To him who has more shall be given. That's what God expects of us. That's the parable of the talents. It's a parable that we've probably discussed several other times in the past. I hope that this class has been of benefit to you. Next week, what we're going to discuss is the parable of the rich fool that happens in Luke the 12th chapter, verses 16 through 20. Somebody who tears down their barns to build bigger. We only have 2 more classes after this. We have next week and then the week after, and then we're going to move into something else. 2 weeks from tonight, we're going to discuss, or I'm going to talk about the class we're having after that. As of the time of this recording, we're still meeting in quarantine. We're still doing digital classes. That may very well change in the future. I don't know when. But these classes will always be available in person, online, will be available on our Facebook page. So stay tuned if you've enjoyed these studies, and I hope to see you next week. Thank you, everybody.